He says, you keep talking about two-house theology as if it were wrong when the Bible is full of remarks and prophecies about the two houses of Israel and even within Judaism. Okay, that's his full comment. We're going to stop there. Somebody else wrote in and asked about two-house theology. There is a difference between noting the two houses of Israel, that is Judah and Israel, that we find in the Bible, and noting modern, what is referred to as two-house theology. Two-house theology, let's just go down a little bit of history here. Two-house theology really becomes to the forefront of as a theological viewpoint within the 60s. And I think that two-house theology is actually one of the marks of the Hebrew roots movement, because those who believed in two-house theology ultimately they kind of grew into the Hebrew roots movement in the 80s. The first people who held to two-house theology basically borrowed a lot of the theology from British Israelism. British Israelism believed that Britain was one of the lost tribes of Israel, and that they had been displaced, and that they were basically, if you were part of that nation, you were Israel, and that you were.
And some of them pushed so far that the coronation stone and everything of the kings of Britain was the Davidic line.
Right.
I mean, it's pretty in depth, and you have in America, you have in the 1600s, 1700s, you have a kind of rewriting of the Indian tribes as being thought of the lost tribes, and of course we know the now famous Joseph Smith took that and ran with it and said these are the lost tribes, and you have earlier kind of movements, but. So to clarify, what Caleb's talking about now is we're looking at the one over the last 20, 30 years and how it's developed.
Right. And so basically what you have is in the 80s, you have people take this, well, actually in the 60s this happens, but up into the 80s, you have this shift from just a two-house theology that's come from British Israelism into what I would call the Hebrew roots theology of two-house theology. This is really promoted and pushed by Batya Wooten. And she wrote multiple books my dad tried to write a review of Batya Wooten's book, The Two Sticks or whatever it's called. Mm-hmm. And every time he got done with his critique, she had written a new edition of it. And so he never actually published that. But the point is that there were many problems with that view. At the very core of that view, even though it was subtle, what basically was being pushed was this idea that if you were a Christian, I can show you quotes. If you were a Christian who felt a love for Israel and or felt a want to keep the commands of God, such as the Sabbath, kosher, and festivals, you didn't know it maybe, but really you were part of the lost tribes. And there were all these kind of events where you'd go, and I remember one specific event. I went with my father. He was dropping off some books at a book table at some conference somewhere, and basically they had all these banners of the different tribes of Israel, and they would ask questions like, "Okay, what's your favorite color? Is your favorite color blue?" And some people would raise their, then you're part of the tribe of Dan. And then people, so what do you do for a living? Well, I'm an accountant. Oh, are you good with money? Yes. Oh, okay. You're part of the tribe of Judah. I mean, they made up all these arbitrary ideas, and then all these people would go stand under the flags. I'm not joking. It was very odd and very weird. And some of this stuff still goes on. Now, this was back in the 90s, okay? And when we talk about two-house theology today, people say, no, that's not what two-house theology is. Okay, well, it might not be what it is today because it has basically morphed even more because, honestly, it was so ridiculous that people couldn't jump on board with them. So now today, what people mean by two-house theology is the idea that there is Judah, which is the Jews living in Israel, which I still don't necessarily agree with, and that there is then Israel, which are the lost tribes, and they're kind of scattered all over the place. Now, that's true. Israel is scattered. There's no doubt about that. But the point is that what that does for two-house theology, some people would say, well, if you love the Lord or whatever and keep Torah, then you're part of the tribes. Other people would say no. Other people have made it a salvation issue. Those who are truly saved are actually part of the lost tribes of Israel. And so really when we talk about two-house theology in 2020, the question that we have to ask is, what brand of two-house theology are you? If we're just going to talk about the idea that Israel was separated into Judah and Israel because of their sin, and that this is actually a punishment, and back in when we come into the new covenant era, or whatever you want to say, that's probably the wrong word because there's so many different things associated with that. When the new covenant comes to its fullest amount, and Israel as a nation is seen as followers of Christ, guess what happens in Jeremiah? Judah is gone. It's just Israel. So they get brought back into one nation. Certainly, if that's what you're going to call two-house theology, that Israel is scattered, Judah is scattered, and that at some point God's going to bring them back and make them one nation that is ruled by the Messiah, sure, I'm fully on board with that. But that is not what two-house theology today is seen as. Thank you so much for watching this video. Tell us your thoughts on this subject by leaving a comment in the comment section. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, and enable those notifications. And we'll see you in the next video.